Imagine running for your life, only to realize the monster chasing you isn't a creature at all, it's you. What happens when your worst fear is no longer something lurking in the shadows, but a twisted reflection of yourself? Hold on tight as we unravel a chilling tale of survival, betrayal, and the darkness within. Will Ellie escape, or is she doomed to become the very thing she fears? Stay till the end to find out. You won't believe the shocking twist. Underneath the pale glow of the street lamp, a single crow cawed. Its sound cut through the quiet, an icy shard in the night's stillness. Ellie stepped onto the cracked pavement, her breath clouding in the cold air. The city felt abandoned, but she knew better. The case file she clutched trembled slightly in her hands. Victim 7, the label read. Her fingers tightened, crinkling the edges of the paper. She glanced at the alley to her right, where the first body had been found. A faint metallic scent lingered in the air. It mingled with the acrid smell of damp concrete. Ellie swallowed hard, her chest tightening. The details of the reports were vivid. A severed hand had been discovered here, clutched in the victim's own mouth. The image replayed in her mind, unbidden. She had read it over and over, unable to comprehend the sheer savagery. But tonight, she wasn't just reading. She was in it. Her flashlight beam sliced through the dark, illuminating glistening puddles. Her footsteps echoed, muted yet sharp. Somewhere behind her, a faint scuffle of movement. She turned sharply, heart pounding. The alley was empty, but something was wrong. The atmosphere seemed heavier, pressing against her skin. Her breathing quickened, shallow and rapid. She forced herself forward, her pulse racing. The second crime scene wasn't far. Each step felt louder than the last, reverberating like a ticking clock. She reached the spot, a rusted dumpster with peeling graffiti. It was here that the torso had been left, headless, limbless, an anonymous shell of what had once been a person. Ellie's flashlight flickered. The sudden darkness gripped her, suffocating and absolute. She froze, gripping her flashlight with trembling fingers. A low, guttural sound rumbled in the shadows. It wasn't human. Her blood turned cold, her instincts screaming at her to run. But she stood rooted, her legs betraying her. A sudden, sickly sweet smell wafted past her.
Run. Putrid.
The sound came again, closer this time. A whisper in the dark. Her flashlight sputtered back to life. The beam revealed a flash of something wet. And then, a face. Half hidden behind the dumpster, pale and slack. Its eyes wide open, milky and lifeless. Ellie's breath hitched, her stomach twisting. The face wasn't just pale, it was familiar. It was the face of the seventh victim. The flashlight trembled in her grip as she stepped closer. The face wasn't attached to a body. It rested on the cold, wet ground, staring up at her. A guttural sound broke the silence again, this time right behind her. She spun around, her beam darting through the alley. Nothing. Only the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Her skin crawled, the air now electric with tension. A faint crunch of gravel behind her sent her spiraling into panic. She spun again, her flashlight catching something in the distance. A figure. Tall, hunched and unmoving. It stood at the end of the alley, shrouded in shadow. Ellie's throat tightened as she tried to call out, but her voice wouldn't come. The figure took a step forward, its movement deliberate and slow. She stumbled back, her heel catching on a crack in the pavement. The flashlight clattered to the ground, its beams spinning wildly. Darkness enveloped her for a moment, and she scrambled to retrieve it. When the light steadied, the figure was gone. Ellie's breaths came in short, sharp bursts. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled. Something brushed against her shoulder. She screamed, whipping around with the flashlight. No one was there. The air felt suffocating now, heavy with the scent of decay. Her eyes darted to the dumpster again. The face was gone. The realization sent a wave of nausea crashing over her. She stumbled backward, her legs weak, her mind racing. The whisper came again, closer than before. It wasn't words, just a sound.
Low. Wet.
Inhuman. Ellie's flashlight flickered once more, and then went out completely. In the suffocating darkness, something reached out and brushed against her hand. Cold, clammy, and deliberate. Ellie yanked her hand back, stifling a scream. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out everything but the oppressive silence. Then, a sharp snap broke the quiet. It came from the dumpster. Her instincts screamed to run, but her legs refused to move. The flashlight flickered back to life, casting a pale, shaky beam across the alley. The dumpster lid had been lifted just slightly, as if someone or something was peeking out. Ellie froze, her breathing shallow, her fingers gripping the light so tightly it hurt. A hand emerged, not a severed hand, but one attached to something unseen, long and skeletal. Its fingers curled slowly over the edge of the dumpster. The nails were blackened, the skin stretched tight over bones. Ellie's throat went dry as the hand gripped the rim, steadying itself. Then, a head rose above the lid. It wasn't human. Its eyes were too large, its mouth too wide, its skin a sickly, mottled gray. It grinned at her, a grotesque smile full of jagged teeth. Ellie stumbled back, her flashlight beam trembling as it stayed fixed on the creature. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring her terror. The whispers started again, but this time they were clearer. Her name. Ellie. Over and over, the thing rasped her name, its voice like dry leaves scraping against stone. Her mind screamed at her to flee, but her body remained frozen. The creature crawled over the edge of the dumpster, its limbs impossibly long. It stood hunched, towering over her, its grin widening impossibly. Ellie finally found her voice and screamed. The sound echoed down the alley, swallowed quickly by the oppressive darkness. The creature lunged. And then, everything went black. Ellie's scream was cut short, her breath stolen from her lungs. She felt herself fall, her body hitting the cold, wet pavement. Her flashlight clattered away, its beam flickering wildly before dying out completely. She couldn't see, but she could feel. A weight pressed down on her chest, cold and suffocating. The creature was above her. Its breath was rancid, hot and foul against her face. She tried to move, to push it away, but her arms felt like lead. The whispers began again, louder this time, filling her ears. Ellie, Ellie, Ellie. Each repetition was more guttural, more frenzied. Her heart hammered as something sharp grazed her cheek. A finger, a claw. She couldn't tell. It traced a slow, deliberate line down to her neck, cold and biting against her skin. She choked back a sob, tears spilling from her eyes. And then, as quickly as it began, the weight was gone. The whispers stopped. Ellie gasped for air, her chest heaving as she struggled to sit up. Her hands fumbled in the dark, searching for her flashlight. When she found it, her trembling fingers managed to switch it on. The beam illuminated the alley, revealing nothing but shadows and glistening puddles. The dumpster was empty, its lid closed. The alley was silent again, save for the distant hum of the city. Ellie scrambled to her feet, her legs shaking beneath her. Her eyes darted around, searching for any sign of the creature. The face, the hand, the whispers, all gone. But the smell lingered. That sickly, rotten stench clung to the air, heavy and oppressive. And then she saw it. On the ground, where she had fallen, was a message, scrawled in thick, dark letters, glistening wet under her flashlight's beam. #7. Her stomach dropped, the number twisting in her mind like a cruel joke. Ellie stumbled backward, the realization hitting her like a punch to the chest. The whispers hadn't been random. They weren't just calling her name. They were claiming her. Ellie's flashlight flickered again. And this time, it didn't come back on. The darkness swallowed her whole. Ellie stood frozen in the consuming blackness, her breath shallow and ragged. The silence pressed against her eardrums, deafening and alive. Her pulse thudded like a drumbeat, echoing in the empty expanse of the alley. She fumbled in her jacket pocket for her phone, her fingers trembling violently. Finally, she gripped it, the cold metal grounding her for a fleeting moment. She unlocked the screen, the faint glow illuminating her face. But before she could dial, a sharp click echoed behind her. It was the sound of a blade being unsheathed. Her stomach twisted. She spun around, the phone's light barely cutting through the oppressive dark. And there it was. The creature stood just a few feet away, its elongated form towering, its grin impossibly wide. In one hand, it held a jagged knife, slick with something dark and glistening. Its other hand stretched toward her, the fingers impossibly long, beckoning her closer. Her phone slipped from her grasp, hitting the ground with a dull clatter. She wanted to scream, but her throat felt like it was closing in on itself. The creature tilted its head, the motion sharp and unnatural, its black eyes boring into her soul. "Ellie," it rasped, the voice guttural and layered, as though a dozen mouths spoke at once. She staggered back, her heel catching on the uneven pavement again. This time she didn't fall. Instead, she bolted. Her legs moved on instinct, propelling her away from the creature. The darkness swallowed her surroundings, and she ran blindly, the sound of her heartbeat drowning out everything else. But then she heard it. The footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and closing in. Ellie's lungs burned. Her legs screamed in protest. But she didn't stop. She turned a corner sharply, her shoulder grazing a brick wall. She could hear it breathing now, wet, guttural breaths that sent icy chills down her spine. Her eyes darted around, desperate for an escape. Ahead of her, a door. Rusty and old, but slightly ajar. She lunged for it, slamming it shut behind her and twisting the lock. The alley fell silent again. She pressed her ear to the door, her chest heaving, straining to catch any sound. A single knock.
Slow.
Rhythmic. Then the whispers returned. Soft at first, but growing louder, filling the small space she'd trapped herself in. And then she realized. She wasn't alone in the room. The whispers surrounded her, curling around her like smoke, suffocating and close. Ellie's back pressed against the cold, metal door, her fingers digging into the rusted surface. The room was pitch black, save for the faint sliver of moonlight seeping through a cracked window high above. Her breath hitched as the air grew thick with that putrid, rotten stench. Something moved in the shadows. A faint shuffle, then another. Her pulse thundered, her eyes straining to adjust to the darkness. "Who's there?" she croaked, her voice barely more than a whisper. No answer. Only the sound of faint, deliberate breathing. Ellie reached for her phone on instinct, only to remember she had dropped it in the alley. She cursed under her breath, her trembling hands now searching the walls for a switch, a weapon, anything. Her fingers brushed against something cold and smooth.
A chain.
She tugged it without thinking. A single, dim bulb flickered to life, casting a sickly yellow glow over the room. The sight froze her blood. The room wasn't empty. Scattered across the floor were remnants of something sinister. Photos. Hundreds of them. All of her. Some were taken from afar, her leaving her apartment, entering her car. Others were impossibly close, her sleeping, her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Her knees buckled, and she staggered back, her heart racing with terror. In the center of the room, a crude altar stood. On it sat a pile of objects that made her stomach churn, locks of hair, fragments of clothing, and what looked like teeth. Her name was scrawled across the walls in jagged letters, written in what looked disturbingly like blood. And then she saw it. In the far corner of the room, crouched low to the ground, was the creature. Its head tilted upward, the dim light casting grotesque shadows across its face. It grinned at her, wider than ever, its teeth glinting unnaturally. In its bony hands it held a photo, the most recent one. A picture of her, standing in this very room. Ellie's legs gave out, and she collapsed to the floor. The creature began to rise, its movements slow, deliberate, and horrifyingly fluid. It held the photo toward her, its jagged fingers trembling with excitement. "Ellie," it rasped, its voice filling the room, dripping with malice. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then, the light bulb shattered, plunging her into darkness once again. The glass rained down like tiny shards of ice, scattering across the floor with soft, brittle clinks. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as the darkness wrapped around her, thick and suffocating. The whispers returned, louder now, circling her, echoing off the walls. Her name, over and over. "Ellie, Ellie, Ellie." She scrambled backward, her hands slipping on the cold, slick floor. Her mind screamed for her to move, to run, but she felt trapped, her limbs heavy with dread. A faint scuttling sound filled the room, sharp and quick, like nails scraping against concrete. It was moving, circling her, stalking her. Her chest tightened, panic clawing its way up her throat. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice cracking, desperation lacing her words. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving a silence, so intense it pressed against her ears. And then a voice, low, guttural, and chillingly close. "Why run, Ellie? You're already mine." The words sliced through her, cold and final. A sudden sharp pain erupted in her shoulder as something grabbed her, its grip icy and unrelenting. She screamed, her body jerking as she tried to wrench herself free. The creature's breath was hot against her neck, foul and putrid, as it leaned in closer. Her fingers fumbled across the floor, desperate for anything she could use as a weapon. They brushed against something sharp, a shard of glass from the shattered bulb. Without thinking, she gripped it tightly, ignoring the sting as it sliced into her palm. With all her strength, she swung upward, the jagged edge cutting through the air. A guttural roar filled the room as the creature recoiled, its grip loosening for a moment. Ellie didn't waste a second. She bolted, her legs trembling beneath her, but carrying her toward the door. Her hands found the lock, slippery with sweat and blood, and she fumbled to turn it. Behind her, the creature let out an ear-splitting shriek, the sound reverberating in her skull. She yanked the door open and stumbled into the alley, the cold night air hitting her like a wave. But the whispers followed. Soft at first, then louder, chasing her as she ran. She didn't look back.
Couldn't.
The streetlights flickered as she sprinted, her lungs burning, her heart pounding like a drum. The whispers seemed to seep into her mind now, crawling under her skin. Ahead of her, the streets stretched endlessly, the shadows growing darker, deeper. And in the distance she saw it. Another figure, standing still, waiting for her. Ellie skidded to a halt, her chest heaving, her vision swimming with panic. The figure ahead was motionless, cloaked in shadow beneath a flickering street lamp. It wasn't the creature. This was someone or something else. Her legs trembled as she stepped backward, her instincts screaming to flee, but there was nowhere to go. Behind her, the whispers grew louder, their rasping chorus closing in. The figure under the lamp tilted its head, an unnatural movement that sent shivers down her spine. Ellie's voice cracked as she called out, Who are you?" The figure didn't respond. It stepped forward, one slow, deliberate pace at a time. As it moved into the dim light, Ellie saw its face, or lack of one. It was smooth, featureless, a blank canvas of pale skin. Her stomach twisted, nausea rising in her throat. The whispers swelled, wrapping around her like a vice, suffocating and cold. The creature behind her roared, a sound that shattered the night like breaking glass. Ellie whipped around, her pulse hammering in her ears. It was there, towering, its jagged grin gleaming in the darkness. The two figures, the faceless one ahead and the creature behind, were closing in.
Trapped.
Her mind raced, frantic for a way out. The alleys seemed to stretch endlessly, the shadows alive and shifting. She clenched her fists, the shard of glass still cutting into her palm. Blood dripped onto the pavement, dark and glistening. Ellie's breathing slowed, her panic giving way to a desperate resolve. If she was going to die here, she wouldn't go quietly. She spun to face the creature, her voice trembling but strong. "Come on, then," she snarled, raising the shard. The creature laughed, a guttural, mocking sound that shook her to her core. It lunged. She slashed wildly, the shard connecting with something solid. A howl of rage filled the air as the creature staggered back, its form flickering like a dying flame. Ellie didn't wait. She turned and ran straight toward the faceless figure. As she approached, it raised an arm, pointing down the street. Her eyes followed its gesture, and for the first time, she saw it. A faint glow in the distance, a doorway bathed in golden light. Hope flickered in her chest. She sprinted toward it, the whispers and roars behind her blending into a cacophony of chaos. The doorway grew closer, its light warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the icy dread clawing at her heels. But just as she reached it, a hand, cold, clawed, and unyielding, gripped her ankle. Ellie crashed to the ground, the impact jarring her bones. Her outstretched hand scraped against the rough pavement, the golden glow of the doorway just inches away. The clawed hand tightened around her ankle, its grip icy and unrelenting. She screamed, twisting her body, kicking wildly with her free leg. The creature's growl reverberated through the air, low and guttural, vibrating in her chest. Her foot connected with something solid, a crack of impact. The grip loosened for a split second, and Ellie scrambled forward, dragging herself toward the light. The golden glow spilled over her, warm and otherworldly, pulling her in like a lifeline. But behind her, the whispers reached a fever pitch. They clawed at her mind, tearing through her thoughts, screaming her name with maddening intensity. Her vision blurred, and for a terrifying moment, she felt herself slipping. The creature lunged again, its shadow stretching grotesquely across the ground. Ellie flung herself into the doorway, the warmth engulfing her like a protective shield. The instant she crossed the threshold, the whispers stopped. The growl of the creature faded into silence. She turned, gasping for breath, her body trembling. The alley was gone. In its place was a vast, endless void, swirling with black and gray mist. The creature stood at the edge of the doorway, its form pulsating with rage. It couldn't follow her. The golden light of the doorway kept it at bay, its claws swiping futilely at the invisible barrier. Ellie's heart pounded as she stepped back, her gaze locked on the monstrosity. But then, a new sound reached her ears. A voice. Soft, melodic, and strangely familiar. "Ellie," it called, gentle and inviting. She turned to face the source. The light stretched ahead of her, forming a path that disappeared into the mist. At the end of the path stood a figure. Not faceless this time. It was her, smiling, waiting. The voice came again, layered and echoing. "Come closer. You're safe now." Ellie's legs trembled as she took a hesitant step forward. Behind her, the creature roared, the sound distant yet threatening. Ahead, the figure extended a hand. Ellie's mind screamed at her to stop, but her body moved on its own, drawn toward the doppelganger's warmth. The light grew brighter with each step, the figure's smile widening. And then she noticed the eyes. They weren't hers. They were black, endless voids that mirrored the creature's grin. The door behind her slammed shut. Ellie froze, her blood turning to ice. The figure's smile stretched impossibly wide, splitting its face in a grotesque mockery of her own. Its hand remained extended, fingers unnaturally long, nails sharp and glinting in the golden light. Behind her, the sound of the door slamming echoed endlessly in the void, a chilling finality. The mist thickened around her, curling at her feet, cold and damp. Ellie, the figure cooed, its voice soft yet wrong, layered with an undertone of malice. Come to me. You've made it this far. Ellie's breath hitched, her instincts screaming to run, but there was nowhere to go. The path of light beneath her feet flickered, dimming with every second she hesitated. She took a step back, her eyes darting between the figure and the now-sealed door. The creature outside had been terrifying, but this was something worse. The figure cocked its head, mimicking the same unnatural motion she had seen before. It began to move toward her, slow and deliberate, its footsteps silent. Ellie stumbled, her heart pounding as she tripped over her own feet. She hit the ground hard, the cold seeping through her skin. The figure loomed above her now, its dark eyes devouring her, its smile splitting wider. You've always belonged here, it whispered, leaning closer. Ellie's hands scrambled across the floor, her fingers searching for anything she could use to defend herself. They closed around something cold and sharp, a shard of glass. Her palm throbbed as she realized it was the same piece she had taken from the alley. The figure laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that made her stomach churn. Do you think that will help you? It sneered, its voice morphing into a guttural growl. Ellie gritted her teeth, her fear boiling into defiance. Without hesitation, she swung the shard upward, aiming for its grinning face. The figure moved unnaturally fast, catching her wrist in an iron grip. Its touch burned, icy, and searing at the same time. You can't fight what you are, it hissed, pulling her closer, its black eyes consuming her vision. Ellie screamed, her other hand clawing at the ground, desperate for escape. But the light around her flickered again, dimming until only the figure's face remained visible. Let go, it whispered, its tone almost tender, as if coaxing her into surrender. Ellie's strength faltered, her vision swimming. And then, just as she felt herself slipping into the darkness, a voice, faint and distant, but unmistakable. Her own voice. Ellie, wake up. The sound tore through the void like a bolt of lightning, jolting her back to awareness. The shard in her hand pulsed with warmth, glowing faintly. The figure recoiled, its grin faltering, its black eyes narrowing. Ellie seized the moment, thrusting the shard into the figure's chest. A piercing, inhuman scream filled the void as the figure dissolved into the mist. The golden light surged, blinding her, swallowing everything. And then, silence. When Ellie opened her eyes, she was lying on the pavement, the cool night air brushing her skin. The alley was empty. The whispers were gone. But the shard of glass remained in her hand, glowing faintly in the moonlight. And carved into its surface was a single, haunting word. Next. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the word etched into the glass. Next. The weight of it pressed down on her chest like a physical force. Her body was still trembling, her heart racing, but the world around her had returned to an eerie stillness. She slowly rose to her feet, her legs shaky as she glanced around the alley. It looked just like it had before, empty, silent. But something was wrong. The shadows seemed deeper now, as if they had shifted in her absence. The streetlights flickered above her, casting long, unsettling shapes on the walls. She looked down at the shard in her hand again. The glowing had faded, leaving only a faint imprint of light where the word had been. But it wasn't just the word that haunted her, it was the sudden feeling that she wasn't alone. A chill ran through her body, and she turned, half expecting the creature to reappear from the shadows. But nothing. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the very atmosphere held its breath, waiting. Next, Ellie whispered to herself, the word foreign on her tongue. The distant hum of the city felt far away, like it no longer belonged to her. Her mind raced. Had she really escaped? Had she won? Or was this just the beginning of something worse? The thought gnawed at her, a growing fear twisting in her stomach. She took a hesitant step forward, the sound of her footfall sharp in the silence. And then, a soft sound, almost imperceptible, caught her attention. A low hum, distant at first, but steadily growing louder. Ellie froze, her body tensing. The noise was coming from behind her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as she turned slowly. She wasn't alone anymore. A figure stepped out from the darkness. At first, she thought it might be a person, but as they emerged into the dim light, her stomach twisted in horror. It was a reflection of herself. Not her face, though. This version was pale, drained of all color, its eyes hollow, and its mouth stretched wide in a cruel smile. Ellie took a step back, heart pounding. It didn't move like her. It tilted its head, mirroring her exact motions, but its movements were jagged, unnatural. A laugh, soft and chilling, escaped its lips. Next, it whispered, its voice distorted, wrong. Ellie's pulse thundered in her ears. It was her, but it wasn't. A reflection, a shadow, a twisted version of the thing she had tried to escape. And now it was following her. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. Her mind raced as the figure took a step closer. She clenched the shard in her hand, heart hammering. The alley stretched before her, long, endless, and filled with the echo of her own footsteps. But this time, she was not running from the creature. She was running from herself. Ellie's heart raced, every beat echoing in her skull. She backed away, her eyes locked on the twisted reflection of herself. The creature's cruel smile widened, its hollow eyes never leaving hers. It mirrored her every movement, step by step, its movements jerky and unsettling. But it wasn't the same. This version of her was wrong. Its smile didn't hold warmth, only malice, a reflection of something dark she didn't want to face. Next, it whispered again, its voice like nails scraping across glass. Ellie's breath hitched. It was a game now, wasn't it? A sick, twisted game. And she had no idea what the rules were. She reached for the shard of glass in her hand, the cool edge biting into her palm, but she didn't feel comforted by it. It was just a shard, after all. A weapon that might protect her, or one that might only make things worse. Her reflection, no, it wasn't her, took another slow step forward, and Ellie's legs went stiff with panic. She turned, the alley stretching out before her, darker than ever, the shadows thick and suffocating. This wasn't the same alley. The lights overhead flickered, casting long, jagged shapes across the walls. The city hum that had once been distant now felt suffocatingly close. She took another step back, her eyes flicking between the thing in front of her and the endless blackness behind her. The figure chuckled low, the sound dripping with mocking amusement. Ellie's stomach churned. "Where are you going, Ellie?" it asked, its voice smooth, predatory. She stopped. Her breath was shallow, every muscle tense. The figure's eyes gleamed with something terrible, and in that moment, Ellie understood. It wasn't just following her. It was waiting. Waiting for her to make a move. Waiting for her to run. Ellie's mind screamed for her to flee, to keep moving, to escape. But then she remembered the word. Next. It had always been a cycle, hadn't it?
Run.
Escape. But the figure would always be there. A reflection, a shadow, a nightmare that would never let her go. This time, Ellie didn't run. She stood her ground, the shard of glass gripped tightly in her hand, her chest rising and falling with steady breaths. She would not be its prey. This time, she would end it. With one swift motion, she hurled the glass shard toward the figure. It collided with its chest, but the creature didn't falter. It just laughed, and the world around her faded into darkness. Ellie's heart stopped as the laughter of the creature swallowed the alley, growing louder, more distorted with each passing second. The world around her seemed to distort with it, walls bending in, shadows creeping closer. But she wasn't afraid anymore. The shard of glass had shattered upon contact with the figure, scattering into 1,000 jagged pieces, but the creature hadn't flinched. It still stood there, grinning, its eyes burning with malevolent glee. Ellie's body tensed as the sound of the creature's breath grew louder, more sinister, but instead of fear, there was only a strange sense of clarity. She had been running for too long, but the chase would never end. The creature was part of her now. The figure stepped forward again, but this time Ellie didn't move.
She didn't retreat.
Next, the creature whispered once more, but the word didn't send a shiver of dread through her this time. Ellie stepped closer, her voice calm, steady as she faced it head-on. No, the creature faltered. For the first time, its grin twitched, the edges of its mouth trembling as if it couldn't comprehend the refusal. Ellie's eyes locked onto its hollow gaze, and she understood. This thing, this twisted reflection, had been born of her own fears, her own darkness. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She stepped forward, into the center of the creature's reach, her hand outstretched. The shadowed figure recoiled as if it could feel her resolve, its form flickering and distorting. Ellie's fingers brushed against its skin, cold and brittle. And with that simple touch, everything changed. The creature screamed, a sound that split the air, reverberating through the alley and then through the very fabric of reality. It trembled, cracked, and then shattered like glass, vanishing into nothingness. The night fell silent. The mist that had surrounded her dissipated, and the alley was once again still, its oppressive weight lifted. Ellie stood alone, her breathing steady now. The word, next, was gone from the glass shard, the faint glow finally fading. The nightmare had ended.
For now.
She turned, stepping into the street, the familiar hum of the city now soft and distant. The night held no more shadows, no more whispers. For Ellie, the journey was over. But something told her, deep down, that the story was far from finished. And so, with a final glance at the darkened alley, she walked away.